Okay, no questions. I guess we'll just get started. Okay, so like I said, anxiety disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder. So we're on chapter 6. Um, just a quick look at the week. It's looks similar to last week in that we have three, like all of this week is just focused on chapter 6, and that's just because it's a pretty large section. So same like with the mood disorders, we have a lot to cover. Um, so hopefully we get through anxiety at least by Wednesday, and then by Wednesday we should have started the obsessive and compulsive disorders too. So a lot to cover this week. Something that is important that we already kind of talked about last week and the previous week, I think, our assignment number 3 is due this Sunday. So number was incorrectly labeled as last Sunday. We fixed that, so you did not have to turn it in, but it's been open for submission if you want to do it. I recommend listening to the lecture, reading the chapter slide, or yeah, listening to the lecture, reading the chapter readings, and then doing the assignment. Because the topic of the assignment is related to this week's content. So you have until Sunday if you're choosing to do the assignment. And just a reminder that there are 4 total assignments that are offered. Only 3 of them count towards your grade. So if you missed assignment 2, the one that was right before spring break, you have to do this one, assignment 3 and assignment 4. That way you get all 3 assignment credits. If you've done assignment 1 and assignment 2, you don't have to do assignment 3 if you can't make it the Sunday, but don't forget you would have to do the last one. So just be thinking about if you're doing it, and if you're not, are you using this as your missed assignment? Any questions about that? Nope. Okay. So, again, we're going to talk about anxiety disorders and the obsessive compulsive and related disorders. Within the anxiety disorder section, there are many diagnoses to be looking at. Oh, I see a hand.
Hi,
Go for
sorry.
it.
I was trying to find the PowerPoint, but it says it's unpublished. It has this weird lock sign. I'm not sure if anyone else is having difficulty or if it's just me. Sorry about that.
I don't know if you're talking yet. I think if you have your hand raised, feel free to
Oh, can you
start.
hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Okay. I cannot hear you if you're talking right now. I'll check the chat later, but if you can unmute yourself at some point and you still have the question, just go for it. Otherwise, I'll continue. Okay. So we have different anxiety-based disorders. And so this is all of them in the section, and I think we'll generally cover most of these. And then the obsessive and compulsive related disorders will primarily touch on OCD, but I'll briefly touch on some of the other ones like trichotillomania, excoriation disorder, um, things like that. So that's what our week looks like. These are the disorders we're going to be covering. And we'll start with anxiety disorders. So when we think about anxiety, one of the things we want to look at, as always, is what's normative, what's abnormal, and what falls along that continuum. So where on that continuum is it normative to have some of these feelings of anxiety, feelings of fear, and then where does it start veering towards a disorder? So is it starting to cause impairment? Is it out of proportion than what would be expected if there is some sort of norm around fear or anxiety? And so in order to do that, we need to disentangle fear and we need to separate that from anxiety. And they're not one and the same, but they're related and they're oftentimes used interchangeably, but they're not the same. So, fear is an immediate emotional response to danger or a perceived threat in the environment in the present moment. So, at present, it's your immediate emotional response to a perceived threat or danger. It's about something that's happening right now. And I'm going to use this analogy of like an alarm reaction. It's like your alarm bell going off in your body, signaling there's danger. This is clearly tied to evolution. So it's an evolutionarily adaptive response that our body has to perceive threat, perceive danger in the environment, and feel fear, because then that allows us to act on it. So if we think, you know, way back when, if they're, you know, I don't know, thousands and thousands of years ago, if you're thinking about seeing, I don't know, like a snake in the environment, the snake can poison you, can infect you, whatever. There's a lot of risk or danger at seeing something in the environment that could cause us harm. And so that immediate response, that fear response is adaptive. That helps us decide what we're going to do after the fact. So you've probably heard of fight or flight or freeze response. This fear response is what is kicking in that fight or flight or freeze response. So when we're thinking about fear, your perceived threat, that immediately triggers this whole fight or flight or freeze response. This in and of itself, though, is again normative. Everyone has this. There's an evolutionary backing to it, like it's adaptive. And so we need this fear response because it helps us in terms of our body, in terms of evolutionarily deciding like, is this environment advantageous to us? Is it a harmful environment? We need that. So it's a part of normal development when we think of the specific fears, and, you know, we're kind of fast forwarding to present day. What are the sorts of fears that we might encounter in today's world versus, you know, I don't know, when we were primitive beings back then, like those fears are going to look different, but they're still helpful and they're part of development. So, number one, it's a normal experience for everyone, child, teen, or adult. And when we're thinking about the specific fears that people might have, we're thinking specifically about children and teens, there's going to be some more common fears that are shared around certain things, and we're going to consider that normative. And then when it starts to become a disorder is when some of those things are no longer um, normative for that age range, or if the proportion feels really intense given what the fear is. So this last bullet point is basically what I just said. So most childhood fears are the same across time and culture, and generally unstable over time. So we eventually like grow out of it, so to speak. So if you have a child who's 4 years old, any culture, you may see fear of the dark. So being really scared to sleep in the dark. Maybe they want a nightlight because the dark feels scary. Um, Being scared of monsters, like especially at nighttime, like there's a monster under my bed. And then fear of separation. So like I'm nervous being separated from my caregiver, like whether it's you're going to school or maybe they're going out and you have a babysitter. So a lot of those things are normative in childhood, but we grow out of that eventually. So then, if all of that is normative, when does it actually become a problem? So what I'm saying, out of proportion to the given situation. If you have a fear of the dark, that makes sense, right? If you're like a little 4-year-old, you're in your own room, you have your toddler bed, that's pretty common. When it starts to become a problem, though, is when it's super impairing, like cannot sleep in your own room. This is kind of getting more into some of the sleep disorders that I'm thinking of, but still, it's a problem. If you are unable to sleep in your room, can't sleep at all, poor quality of sleep, it's starting to impact your daily functioning because you're not sleeping at night, and then you go to school, you're falling asleep at your desk, you're missing class information, then you can't do your homework. So a lot of that stems from this disproportionate fear that, although is common among kids, is now out of proportion for this context. When the fear is also not age or stage specific, so let's say this fear of separation, for example, pretty normative. Again, let's say a 3, 4, or 5-year-old having that separation anxiety is normative at the beginning. So, like if you think back to a little kid's first day going to preschool, maybe, and that ends up being, or daycare when they're a little bit earlier. A lot of times parents report like, "Oh my gosh, that was super hard. It was so painful to like see my child start crying when I had to leave the room," and it's like a 4-hour day program. So that's a pretty normative thing. That signals some separation anxiety in a normative context. What makes this not age or stage specific is if this child maybe then is, I don't know, like 11 years old. So fast forward 7, 8 years from there, from that time, and they're still experiencing the same level of separation anxiety. And now it's starting to really be impairing. It's, mom, I can't go to school because I don't want to be separate from you. You can't go to the store because I can't be separate from you. That's when it no longer is age or stage specific. So this now is extending past the normative age range. Persists over an extended amount of time. So like that was actually a good example of it extended from pre-K, like 4 years old, all the way up to this 10, 11 year age range. And then leads to avoidance. So this is an important box because this is what guides then our intervention for people with anxiety disorders. So we kind of talked about this with mood disorders, where there's that cycle of reinforcement when we don't feel well and we don't engage in things that we like and we have negative thoughts. All of that stuff is cyclical and it just kind of maintains your depressive symptoms. Similarly, with anxiety, that cycle also exists. So if we feel anxious about something, and I have thoughts about, like, maybe I'm catastrophizing, like if I don't know, if I'm separate from my mom, that's the worst thing in the world. I'm going to feel like I'm going to die. I'm going to have a panic attack. Those thoughts, right? Coupled with that emotion, probably the behavior that we're going to see coming out of that is avoidance. So I'm just not going to be separate from my mom. I'm never going to go to school. I'm going to insist that I go everywhere with my mom. I'm going to go with her to work. That's where this avoidance of being separate now is reinforced because we've had no opportunities to experience what it's like when you're not together in this separation anxiety example. So it can be cognitive or behavioral. So I just gave an example of behavioral avoidance. Like, I don't want to be separate from my mom, so I'm just not going to go to school. I'm going to avoid going to school. It can be cognitive as well, where it's so distressing to have those thoughts. So I can't even fathom, I can't even tolerate thinking about that thought or emotion. And those together are really coupling, those together like maintain anxiety. And so if you can imagine from a therapy perspective, if we're going to use that CBT model we talked about last week, there's going to be points in that triangle where we're trying to intervene with anxiety by addressing those thoughts if there are any cognitive distortions. And if, from a behavioral perspective, again, last week for mood, we talked about behavioral activation, just getting yourself out there. With anxiety, we're talking about exposure. So we're systematically doing the thing that causes a little bit of anxiety. And you can hear me also using the word fear and anxiety separately. If these boxes still are applicable to anxiety, but just don't forget that fear is different than anxiety. Right now, fear, we're just talking about immediately what do you see in the present and what is your bodily response to that. Okay, so I'm gonna just remind you down here, we said there's pretty consistent and common childhood fears across time in most cultures. And so thinking about that, we're kind of thinking globally here. The age and the number and intensity of fears experienced by children tend to decrease with age. So that's what we were saying earlier about it tends to be unstable. So a lot of times we grow out of it. Girls tend to exhibit a greater number and intensity of fears than boys. And always keeping in mind that these gender differences, I think they're there. Their prevalence rates are pretty consistently shown, and always keeping in mind, like, is it socialization that accounts for some of this gender disparity in terms of our rates? The example here being, is there a difference in socialization of how we can express fear? So is it just more common that young girls might express their fears than little boys? Perhaps. And if the frequency is different, like we just see girls are reporting more than boys, then that's going to account for that gender difference. So that just, keep it in the back of your head. But in general, yes, we tend to see greater number of fears, so multiple fears, and then the intensity tends to be greater than for boys. It's just looking at some of the common fears by age. So fear of strangers makes sense around 6 to 9 months. If we think back to our attachment chapter, early on in like week 1, week 2, we talked about the strange situation where we were looking at attachment. And that really capitalizes on this normative fear of strangers that we see most children experience. So it's a common fear, and that's why it was used in that research context of the strange situation. Fear of imaginary creatures, pretty common around 2 years old. Fear of the dark, around 4 years old. Imaginary threats, around preschool. Physical safety, so that could be around young childhood. And then as we get into like pre-adolescence, adolescence, that's when they tend to become more socially based. So being worried that people are going to, I don't know, make fun of you, or that your competence is not going to be quite up to par with what you want. Again, these seem to be similar across cultures, of course, with some nuances, but it seems that this is pretty standard. Okay, before I go to the anxiety to talk about how that's separate, remember that again, all of this text box right here, these four, those are all related to anxiety. And I'm just curious, since there's only a small group today, does anyone, and you don't have to share if you don't want to, but does anyone have any experience with, like, do you remember your own personal fears as a kid? Like, if you had any, and did you grow out of it? Because I think that would be a good example of this unstable trend over time. Or if you have kids or you work with kids, like, are there any fears that you're seeing in person that you're seeing here on the side as well? I'm gonna stop sharing for a second so I can see the chat. No? Okay. Also, I'm just I see the chat now about the slides. I will double check because I like released all of them, but I think the setting may not be up to date then. So I'll check that. But they are up. Like I think you should be able to see it, but you probably can't click on it. Okay. I was scared of heights to a pretty big degree until I was like age 10. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good example. I think heights is a good example. And it's one that like extends, I think it's not, it wasn't on the slide, but I think a lot of adults probably still have a general fear of heights. Um, yeah, and depending on how intense it is, it could be debilitating, right? If it's like, I refuse to get into any elevators because I'm like that might veer more towards anxiety, like apprehension about what could happen in the future. But just in general, like if you're afraid on an escalator because you're so high up, because the fear response is like strong there, then that could potentially be pretty interfering. I was just thinking of I started working with this kid when he was 5, now he's 6. He's a little bit, I guess his developmental age would be closer to like 4 though, like 4 turning 5. And yeah, he talks about the boogeyman like literally every single session. And we're not working together on like anxiety because his presenting problem is not anxiety. But I just think it's interesting because it's like such a classic example of I think he'll grow out of it. It doesn't feel impairing. It feels pretty normative given his age. But yeah, always like if you were to ask him like what are you what's the biggest thing you're scared of? He would say, "Oh, the boogeyman at night." And it's not actually impacting his sleep. He sleeps quite well. He has a room, he has a nightlight. I think his little sister shares the same room. So it's not impairing. And part of why we're not working on anxiety is it's not what he came in with. And I'm keeping in my mind like how normative it is to have that fear. But if it starts to veer on being out of proportion, or if it feels like he thinks he sees something and it feels quite real, right? That might be concern for like a delusion or something like that, which I'm not saying at all. And he's also not scared. It's not impacting his sleep. He's not stressed. And so it doesn't raise the level of clinical concern. But I use that example because that's something I had to think about is like, okay, this is pretty normative. I'll keep an eye on it. If it changes, that's when, okay, maybe we need to do something. But yeah, this is pretty on par with how old he is. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the slides. So we just did fears. Okay. So how is fear different from anxiety? So remember, fear is about something happening in the immediate present environment. It's a feeling that we have about something that just just happened. It's happening right now. Anxiety is future oriented. So it's more about having apprehension, tension, or a sense of dread about something that is going to happen or potentially may happen. So it's about something that might or will happen in the future. And a lot of times it boils down to a lack of control. Like I don't have certainty about what's going to happen in the future, or I can't control what's going to happen in the future. And that causes a lot of anxiety about what will happen. In general, just like fear, the anxiety itself is there's nothing wrong with it. It's quite adaptive, it's a normative, and it's a helpful emotion. It communicates things to us, information that is useful for us. So it's like a smoke alarm, it can warn us about danger. So this is like on the right hand side, like your burning building, having anxiety is like a smoke alarm saying it's signaling you to take care of it or to do something about it. So that in and of itself is helpful. It warns us about danger. Oops. An example I can think of that isn't necessarily danger, but is helpful anxiety is if you have like, I don't know, like an exam coming up. And again, we're thinking about normative, not like an extreme amount of anxiety, but in general, if you're taking a class and you have an exam coming up, it's pretty normative and probably healthy and helpful to have a little bit of anxiety, right? Like, oh, I have that coming up. I should probably study. Having that anxiety is probably what underlies the motivation to study. I mean, of course, if you're a good student, you're like, I know I need to study for exams. Like that aside, having a little bit of anxiety is what's going to motivate you probably to go study and go do well. Not having any anxiety then might be, I just don't care about it, or like I see nothing wrong with it. I'm have no reason to study. And then the outcome may not be as great as if you did have a tiny bit of anxiety. Um, a teen that I'm working with right now with PTSD, and I'll use her as a case example in a couple weeks when we talk about trauma. Uh, Same thing with her. We talk about some of the like responses that she's developed over time as being like protective in terms of why she has PTSD. But the example I gave her is because she's super vigilant on the sidewalk is yeah, if we're not vigilant, if we have no anxiety about walking on a sidewalk, paying attention to cars, especially in Houston, like, people are not always giving pedestrians the right of way, like that potentially puts us in danger because we kind of have to be vigilant in that situation. So, excuse me, with the anxiety analogy, if we didn't have anxiety, just to like 2%, right? To a 2% degree at least, we probably wouldn't be watching out for our safety in this context where it probably would be helpful. So having a little bit of it is helpful for just keeping ourselves safe or for the outcome that we want. So it's helpful, it communicates something to us that we can then use to go do something about it. A worry, though, is these are thoughts about possible negative outcomes that are intrusive and difficult to control. And that's the cognitive aspect of anxiety. So, again, when we talked about the triangle last week, it applies here as well. So, CBT for anxiety, we think of the emotion tends to be like one of the first signals we have, like I feel the anxiety. And for people who don't have that insight, it's one of the first things we want to really build awareness of. So, where do you carry anxiety? Is that the first thing you feel? And a lot of time, yeah, people feel the emotion, and then the thoughts are the things kind of linked with it. And those thoughts tend to be worry thoughts. So, things like, I don't know, like I use the exam example as like a healthy amount. So, if we're going to turn the dial all the way up to more of a disproportionate amount of anxiety or worry, it might be, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail. And you have like a 98% of the class. Like, I'm going to fail. If I fail this test, I'm going to fail the class. If I fail this class, I won't be able to graduate. If I can't graduate, I'm never going to get a job that I'm going to want, like that I've spent all this time at UH for. Oh my gosh, if I don't get that job, I'm going to be on the streets or whatever. I'm going to go into a crazy amount of debt. Right. That's kind of like that spiral of worry thoughts that tends to happen when the anxiety then is disproportionate. So when we turn the dial up and it's no longer normative or adaptive. And because of those thoughts, that's why we target it in the cognitive component of anxiety. So we'll examine those thoughts. Is there really probability, like how likely is it that this thing that you're worried about is going to happen? Um, and even if it is true, is the intensity helpful here? Probably not. If you're you're throwing up every day, you feel really sick, you have to, your thoughts are so uncomfortable, it's hard to tolerate. So that's where we start targeting that in the CBT model. Okay, so that's just generally what's fear, what's anxiety. As you can see, there's normative and like the abnormal side of the spectrum. And we've already kind of talked about when it turns into an anxiety disorder, but to use the smoke alarm analogy again, an anxiety disorder is like a broken smoke detector. So anxiety becomes detached from degree of real danger. So going back to the slide again, where you can see the smoke alarm, we used this as an example of it's helpful to have a smoke alarm in our house, right? It gives us some anxiety, it gives us some information of, oh, there's smoke coming out. We need to make sure there's not a fire. We need to evacuate when the smoke alarm goes off. That's normative. We need that. It's like hardwired in our bodies. When we have an anxiety disorder, it's like a broken smoke detector. It's like it's alerting us to danger when there's not necessarily danger to begin with, or not enough to rise to the level that a smoke detector beep should be going off. So it's like a broken smoke detector, and that it might be giving us more information, more alerts than we actually need. And that physiologically causes us to have like the physiological side of anxiety. So people might feel like, I don't know, like heart beating fast, so those heart palpitations. Sometimes people feel heart that they have a hard time breathing, chest pain. Sometimes people have to go to the bathroom. They feel like they're going to vomit. So like those things become like a constant a lot of times for these people with an anxiety disorder, because this broken smoke detector alarm is just constantly going off saying danger, danger, danger. So what that means in terms of this last bullet, anxiety becomes detached. It means that like the actual danger that's happening here, this smoke alarm is not actually signaling to us an appropriate amount of information when it's necessary. So now it's not about actually the perceived danger or like the reality of danger. It's now like a little bit separate. It's like where our mind takes us, or how bad it feels physiologically. So this is a little graph that I pulled from like a YouTube video that was I can't remember who it was, but it was a psychologist explaining CBT, and she used this little graphic, and I've like copied and pasted this in my own work with some teens that I've worked with social anxiety. And so I think it's helpful because, again, this speaks to what happens when we have low levels of anxiety, high levels of anxiety, and how it impacts performance. And again, keeping in mind that it is normative until it's not. And so it's helpful when we have a little bit of anxiety. So it's quite a little bit lower. Like, okay, we're all the way at the end, right? Low down here, and our performance is starting down here under the week. When you have no anxiety, performance wise, if we're thinking about that test, we're probably not going to perform as well as we would if we have a little bit more anxiety, which is where this curve is going up. So it's increasing attention and interest, right? That might cause us to study, pay attention in class. So our performance goes up much more. Then there's like the just right amount of anxiety. So let's say like up here in the middle, it's like, okay, now we're getting close. The exam is a week from now or 5 days from now. Like now I'm kicking it into gear. I am studying. You're probably going to have the most optimal performance. You're having the optimal arousal. It's adaptive. It's causing you to study. It's like a good, like 1-to-1 ratio. And then as our anxiety goes up much higher, now on the performance side, it starts to drop. So now the anxiety is too high. Now we're getting to this broken smoke detector analogy, and the performance is dropping because of the strong anxiety, right? So like my thoughts are kind of um spiraling. It's causing like I can't even think anymore. I actually can't even study because my thoughts are so jarbled, or I feel so sick all the time. And so now it's actually negatively impacting my performance. And that's what this little guy is down here. So I like this graph because it has like the little people on it. And I think it's helpful for at least illustrating that there is a healthy dose and it's adaptive. And we can see on either side when there's not enough or too much, those also aren't great outcomes. Okay. Okay, so here's another model. This is the tripart model of anxiety. So again, think of the CBT model. CBT was initially like it's this cognitive triangle that we've been talking about. We use it in depression, we use it in anxiety, but this particular model puts into context anxiety. So we think of anxiety as a multidimensional construct. There's the physiological side, there's the cognitive side, and there's the behavioral side. So similar, right, to our other one in terms of depression. So we talked about emotion, our thoughts, and our behaviors. So the emotion part of the tripart model of anxiety is just a little bit more fleshed out in terms of what's the somatic response. What do you feel inside, and what's automatically happening for you in terms of your body response? So if we look at physiological symptoms, we face increased autonomic arousal. So we might start sweating. The gastrointestinal distress is what I was saying about you might have to go to the bathroom. Hands might be trembling, or maybe your jaw, like your mouth is trembling. You get accelerated heart rate and then flushed face. So that's like your fight or flight in action, right? That's just autonomic response. Sometimes we can't really help it. The cognitive symptoms are those worries that we talked about. So a lot of times, I'm going to point to the blue box down here. It's like rumination. So we're hanging on to something and we're thinking about it and just kind of ruminating, going back to that previous thought. It might be excessive worry. So we talked about worries where these are thoughts about negative outcomes and it's excessive now. And then an obsession in the context of kind of just we are we have really self-critical thoughts sometimes, and again, this is just one type of anxiety, but having self-critical thoughts and kind of just obsessing about maybe perfectionism or I'm not going to do well, um, thoughts of danger and automatic negative thoughts. And then the behavioral symptoms, we already talked about this, it's the avoidance especially. So we see a lot of things, we see two things in a lot of people. One is the avoidance, and that's the thing that functionally gets in the way. That's why a lot of people come to us for anxiety, is because maybe like they're not doing the things they used to be able to do, or it's just getting in the way. They can't go do things that they are supposed to do because of the behavioral avoidance. The thing I think in terms of especially working with kids is this reassurance seeking. So needing a lot of reassurance from parents to say, like, it's okay, you can do that. It's okay. You got it. It's okay. Which is, again, adaptive for a little bit. But when it comes to anxiety, a lot of times that's like this reinforcer of there is something dangerous that you're thinking of, and that's correct. And sometimes that we don't mean for it to happen, but sometimes it reinforces the intensity of the fear that a parent may not be realizing they're doing. So we see a lot of avoidance and reassurance seeking. Behaviorally, we're going to work on the avoidance. In a family context, we might talk about, what's the function of the child always kind of looking back to you. It might be the reassurance seeking, and we might want to work on that in a PMT kind of way. So your textbook makes a point to start talking about like internalizing psychopathology. We've talked about this before, and I don't know if it looks familiar, but when we first talked, I think in week 3, week 4, about the different models of psychopathology, we said the DSM is a categorical system. The DSM says there's X number of or classifications of disorder. So there's the anxiety disorder section, there's OCD section, there's blah, blah, blah. And within each section, there's a set of diagnoses. And all you need is to meet criteria for a particular disorder. And a consequence of that, though, is that there's a lot of overlap between the criteria for one disorder and another. So we tend to see a lot of overlap. And so people get diagnosed with 2 things at a time, 3 things, 4 things even. So that's a criticism of the system, because how helpful is that really if we're just kind of slapping on labels? And if we look at, I don't know, like anxiety and something else where the symptoms might overlap, but the intervention is going to be the same, it may not be as helpful to give them 5 different disorders when the intervention will be one. So there are different models, if you'll remember. So we have dimensional models, one of those being HITOP. We talked about another one called the Achenbach system. And that's what this is. So this is just reminding us that we can think of psychopathology not just as like, here's the anxiety disorder of separation, here's the anxiety disorder of social anxiety. We can think about it in terms of like, where does it fall along the psychopathology spectrum? And so we can think of, here's general psychopathology, like it houses every sort of problem out there, every sort of symptom, if you will. And then we can break it into externalizing and internalizing. So we already have used the word externalizing when we talked about conduct problems and ADHD. Those are externalizing in terms of like the manifestation. So I'm like, if you think about conduct and defiance, it's like acting out versus internalizing tends to be more inside the person, it's internal. So we think of depressive symptoms as being something more within the person versus acting out towards another person or towards an object or thing. So both depression and anxiety would be considered internalizing disorders or internalizing symptoms. And so this internalizing OCD, like anything in the anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorders, any of the mood disorders, those generally would fall under internalizing. So the book makes a point to talk about it just because we've talked about the dimensional models of psychopathology. And I think for your knowledge, it's just helpful for understanding why it just so happens that a lot of people with anxiety also meet criteria for a mood disorder and vice versa, or why your symptoms might be similar. So why is it that like you can have a tummy ache, let's say your 6-year-old has tummy ache all the time, we think it's associated with anxiety, but they also may be having mood problems. And the thing that we say, or that we think the child meets criteria for in a mood disorder, is probably the somatic thing that we're picking up on. So it's because it falls within the same spectrum of symptoms. Yeah, so this next bullet point, so somatic symptoms are common for both anxiety and depressive disorders. So anytime I see like constant, like a kid constantly getting pulled out of school, like going to the nurse's office. And there's no, like the pediatrician says, like there's no health indications of anything going on. It's not like a GI problem. Don't know what it is. That to me kind of signals, oh, I might be seeing some anxiety. And a lot of times it's, I got nervous in class and I just wanted to go home. I wanted my mom to pick me up. I just want to sit in the nurse's office. And it could be anxiety a lot of the time, but it also might be some mood, anxious, depressed stuff going on. Okay. So I'm going to skip this because this is basically more on the internalizing psychopathology spectrum. Um, this table on the left is just showing some of the problems that we might see like physically. So something that might be reported by a parent or a teacher, or even a kid, they might self-endorse themselves if you're giving them a survey, especially for people within this anxious, depressed category. So again, that's why there's a lot of overlap between that flavor of depression and anxiety. Okay. Any questions just before we talk about etiology? Okay. Hmm. So we'll talk about the etiology of anxiety disorders. And I say this every time, but remember there's going to be biological influences and environmental influences, and they're going to interact with one another. So for me, I think one of the most important takeaways that you have from this class is that there's never going to be just one cause or one reason that there's a mental health problem. And I think that in general, the general public, people who are not familiar with psychology, find it very hard to wrap their minds around that because we think of medical disorders or medical problems. Usually you have like one organic cause, like you twisted your ankle, therefore you have like a sprained ankle, right? You were playing soccer, you bent it, and then now you have a sprained ankle. It's not very clear. So that's why I'm always saying like it's always going to be an interaction. Even if you have, we talk about family genetic history a lot. We always say if there's a family mental health history in general, that just increases your risk for you to have mental health problems, given that it interacts with some of these other things. But that also explains why you can have a family mental health history and you have still nothing going on. Again, because it just is a risk factor. It doesn't mean you automatically have it. So, anyways, I say that so much because I want you to take that away that there's not a single cause. It's just going to be like an interaction of different factors going on. So for anxiety in particular, when we're looking at the biological and genetic influences, there's moderate heritability estimates. So pretty average. That's different though if we think back to bipolar disorders where we said there is a higher heritability estimate. Same with schizophrenia, it tends to be much higher. So here, pretty average. Something that's important too is that there's a general tendency of inheriting more anxiety symptoms rather than a specific anxiety disorder. So it's not necessarily that, I don't know, dad has generalized anxiety disorder, therefore you have a higher risk of generalized anxiety disorder. It just might be a greater propensity towards any of the anxiety disorders. So you might end up having, I don't know, social anxiety or separation anxiety. Um, there are inconsistent findings on the role of neurotransmitters, so things like GABA. So I would just read your text. There's a little section on there about um, what are some of the different studies, how is GABA implicated? Like, I think there's a little chart on there or like a graphic. So yeah, not super clear. And again, I think this is important because there's not one specific cause. So yes, we can say there are certain genetic influences. There may be some neurotransmitters that are off a little bit more often implicated in one disorder or over another. And yet, even then, it's not going to explain the prevalence of a particular disorder. The amygdala and portions of the prefrontal cortex play a central role in anxiety. So the amygdala we think of as being associated with heightened activity. We see like people talk about like their emotions and that being kind of mostly tied to the amygdala. So we just think that that one gets like activated when we have anxiety or fear happening. So it amplifies your arousal. And again, some other studies have shown that there might be differences in the reaction time. So reaction time speed of anxious versus non-anxious youth when they're showing them threatening stimuli. So they might have like electrodes on there, like the little cap for EEG, and they might have the control group, which is people without anxiety disorders, and they'll have the target group, which has anxiety disorders, and they might have them do a study and show them like, I don't know, images of a snake, a lion, or like an ocean, like, and seeing how does the person, is there any differences in the like reactivity and what they see in the brain imaging studies, and or they might be tracking like your eye movement and seeing are there differences in reaction time. So again, not necessarily consistent across the board. It just seems that we have a higher arousal, higher propensity when you have an anxiety disorder. Okay. Importantly, for anxiety disorders, we talked about it last week for mood as well, but temperament plays a large part as well, because we think of it as an early risk factor. It still falls within our biological sector. So in particular, behavioral inhibition tends to be an early childhood predictor of anxiety disorders later in life. So behavioral inhibition is like kind of fear of branching out. So we see it when we look at little babies, you tend to see are they behaviorally inhibited or are they behaviorally activated? And so the ones that are a little bit more withdrawn, maybe a little bit less likely to explore around a room or something like that, that sometimes is more, it has a higher it has higher predictive utility of predicting anxiety disorders later in life than say other aspects of temperament. High levels of negative affectivity also contribute to anxiety, depression. We talked about that last week. And then as far as effortful control, we might have low effortful control plus that high negative affectivity interacting with one another. And that might kind of explain some of the early signs of anxiety and the maintenance of it over time. I'm not going to play this video, but if you don't remember what behavioral inhibition is, you might want to watch this. So there's a video here, and then there's obviously a section in your book. Okay. So those were the biological influences. We had genetic influences, some of the neuro, like anatomical influences. We talked about temperament. The other one that's like super important, and especially this is where it really becomes helpful in therapy because we're looking at the environmental influences, and parenting becomes really important for who's in the environment, and how people respond to the environment that the child's in is also really going to be super important. So your book says that within the parenting and environmental influences section, there are three ways that fears and phobias are learned. The first one is through classical conditioning. You guys learned about it early on in our first week of the semester. So if you think back to little Albert in the classical conditioning, there was that little white rat, and it was accompanied by that slamming on the steel bar, the hammer on the steel bar. And of course, he started crying. There was no fear of the rat before. You pair it with this slamming, the natural reflex to the hammer is that he starts crying. There's some fear. And then during conditioning, so there's this period of repetition of pairing the two together, and that causes this natural unconditioned response, this fear response. After conditioning, you don't even need to show the steel hammer. You don't have to keep it paired anymore. The child has already been conditioned to associate this previously neutral stimulus as being associated with this fear response. So we think of fear in general in our life doesn't, we obviously haven't all done this experiments as babies, but you can think of this in the greater context of the environment that a child might be in. So in general, you have an initial exposure to perhaps a threatening event, and then that leads to later avoidance over time. The other one is modeling, and I think this one's a little bit, of course, easier to think through. So whatever's being modeled in the environment is just environmentally that's going to impact what the child sees, and it may be reinforcing fear. So a parent might prompt, model, and reinforce anxious behavior, maybe not intentionally. A lot of times the parent themselves is anxious, but then that communicates danger to the child. And then based on the maybe verbal prompts, which is what this transmission of verbal threat information is below, maybe through saying verbal prompts or by modeling anxiety or saying, oh, no, you don't need to do that, like reinforcing that anxious behavior. That also is one way over time from our early childhood that might influence later anxiety. And the other one, wait, so this is modeling. Like I said, there's three ways. This is the second way. This verbal threat information falls within this kind of modeling idea, except you're just verbally conveying this threat information. Another thing to account for is overprotective or intrusive parenting. Um, and so it's similar to what we saw earlier, but just we're conveying that there's danger. So if we think of overprotective, so someone who maybe is, I don't know, like a parent may be saying like, oh, don't do that. That's dangerous. Don't go do that. Kind of knocking down a lot of these opportunities for novelty and to learn autonomy and to learn that there's no fear or perhaps no fear or enough of fear that you can get over it. That kind of takes away the opportunities that the child might have and might reinforce that this is something scary. This is something to be anxious about. Same thing with intrusive parenting, like doing something, and intrusive is not meant to be like mean. It's not a mean connotation. It just means intrusive in that you do things for the child. So if you're taking over for them, what happens here is the lack of mastery. So like you don't learn how to do it. You don't learn how to, if there is anxiety, you don't learn how to manage it on your own. So you have less self-efficacy. You don't feel like you can take care of it. And then that might give rise to some of the thoughts associated with anxiety. I know I won't be able to do this. I'll never be able to do this. What is she going to say if I don't do this right? So those are other examples of how intrusion or overprotective parenting can impact anxiety for the kid. Okay, I'm gonna cover this slide and then, yeah, we'll cover this and then we'll end. So because of all these components, there's the thoughts involved, the physiological response, what we actually do, we can see how anxiety is maintained over time. So just like the negative cycle of depression that we looked at last week, anxiety works in the exact same way. So if we just look at this little circle on the right, so we experience anxiety, that's this yellow part of the arrow. When we experience anxiety, the natural response is to want to avoid. Like, I don't want to go do that thing that's going to cause me anxiety, or it's going to make me face the thing that I'm like so scared about. When we avoid it, you do get some relief. You don't have to do the thing that made you anxious to begin with, but it's short term. It's only in the immediate. Like it's quite short lived. If I think back to the nurse example, so let's say actually if I give you the whole picture, the kid had like a presentation in their class right after lunch. And now they're feeling really nauseous and queasy after lunch. Their heart's pounding and they have a fear of public speaking. And it's, yes, a lot of people have fear of public speaking, but this is like disproportionate. It's causing them to want to like literally hide and go to the nurse's office. And so let's say, okay, now I'm in the nurse's office during the period that I'm supposed to be presenting. You are physically avoiding it in that situation, and we're cognitively avoiding it because I don't even have to think about, let's say at the bottom, underlying belief is that what will people think? What if people laugh at me? What if I mess up my words? What if my teacher thinks I'm stupid? Let's say those are the underlying thoughts. I get relief from not having to be in that situation that my anxiety is rooted in. The problem, though, is that so that's negative reinforcement. So now we're increasing the probability that we're going to continue avoiding it by taking away the thing that the stimulus that makes it aversive. So, yes, we feel good in the short term, but then that only reinforces that, yeah, this is a scary situation. And actually, I'm not well equipped the next time if I'm ever in that situation. So, if I ever have to present again, yeah, it is so bad that I'm going to need to call my mom. I'm going to need to go to the bus or the nurse's office. So, the trade-off is quite poor in terms of you get short-term relief, yes, but the long-term impact is that that anxiety is maintained over time. And then when you're faced with that same exact anxiety stressor, it's just cyclical. So we become less efficacious, our anxiety goes up, and it just people go years and years feeling like this. So an example of this would be David. So David is extremely afraid of getting on the bus to school. His mom told him he needed to take the bus to school today because she had an important meeting. David got upset and started screaming and crying. So his mom gave in and, I should say, Anne drove him to school. He immediately felt extremely relieved. So here, the avoidance increases anxiety. And what mom just, okay, and then again, there's no judgment. So probably if I were to think about this mom, she has a meeting, she needs to get to her meeting. That's why the child needs to go and get on the bus. There are a lot of good reasons why she probably says, "Oh my gosh, forget it. I'll just take you to school." Probably because she needs to get him to school, get home, go to work, and start her meeting. So remembering that this is no judgment towards the parent or whoever the caregiver is, but in terms of anxiety, just strictly speaking about how this anxiety is maintained in David, what happened is he didn't want to get on the bus. There's some anxiety about the bus. We're not sure what it is yet. He's avoiding it, right? So he's so distraught that he's throwing a tantrum, he's crying, he's screaming, can't deal with it, right? And so mom says, "Ugh, okay, never mind. I'll just take you. You don't have to deal with the bus. The bus is the anxiety stressor, right?" So now he gets short-term relief and because mom has rescued him. And so now that just only further reinforces that the bus is scary. You can't handle it. So that explains David's anxiety and what mom just did. And again, many reasons why she did it and probably make a lot of sense and are what maybe was necessary in that moment, but we might call that family accommodation. So a lot of times family accommodation plays a role in any of the anxiety disorders and especially OCD, where a lot of times parents or caregivers or anyone in the family is trying to be helpful, but they're inadvertently reinforcing the problem behavior, the problem symptom that we're working on. So what this generally might look like is providing reassurance, modifying leisurely activities, doing things instead of the child, and then modifying the work schedule. Those are just examples. And so mom here engaged in family accommodation by modifying the situation for him. I'll take you out of this and I'll just drive you there myself. So again, fine in this moment, maybe it was necessary this one time, but imagine that this keeps happening over time and it's cyclical. So this is just reinforcing each time that she does this, or each time that he's able to escape is us reinforcing the anxiety. And in terms of self-esteem and those thoughts, those just kind of grow rampant, which is not good. Okay, we'll stop there. Any final questions? We're gonna cover extinction next week, or sorry, not next week, on Wednesday. Cover extinction, and then we'll start going through the OCD chapter as well. But I think that's it for today. Yeah, and if there's no other questions, I'll see you Wednesday, unless you're staying on for office hours, which will be on a different link at 10. Right.